So personally, I've been growing tired of current events, and as a result of that, tonight, we're going to dive into DARPA. The reason? Well, I came across something rather interesting. This came from John Greenwald Jr. LP Guise was Jeff Bezos' grandfather. In the late 1950s, he helped found what would become DARPA, and so he tried to get some records from the FBI via a FOIA request. However, he found out that if they had any, they've been destroyed. So, yeah, the grandfather of Jeff Bezos was one of the main guys who started DARPA. This got me thinking about a couple things. In the video entitled The End of Human History as We Know It, we talked about big tech ties to intel agencies. Now we do know that DARPA was instrumental in developing the internet back in the 1970s. They linked 4 supercomputers together to handle massive data transfers, thus creating the architecture of the World Wide Web. By the mid-1990s, the intelligence community was ceding funding to the most promising supercomputing efforts across academia. They funded these computer scientists through an unclassified program that was managed by the CIA and the NSA. It was called the Massive Digital Data Systems Project, MDDS, and so this culminated in what's been dubbed the Birds of a Feather briefing in 1995. This briefing took leading students and scientists from Ivy League schools and funded some of their projects. Coincidentally, of course, it was all initiatives that the intel agencies and DARPA wanted to complete themselves, so a sort of outsourcing took place. Now, the first and most promising MDDS grant went to a computer science research team at Stanford. Both grants funded research by 2 graduate students who were making rapid advances in web page ranking, as well as tracking user searches. Yes, the most important aspect. Anyway, those 2 students were future Google co-founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page. And the same thing happened with Facebook and a DARPA project called LifeLog. So, just to give you a little background on everything, I have a 2-minute clip and then we'll continue.
Quietly posted a broad agency announcement to its website to request proposals for an ambitious new project. Labeled BAA number 03-30, this proposer information pamphlet requested proposals from developers to build an ontology-based subsystem called LifeLog that captures, stores, and makes accessible the flow of one person's experience in and interactions with the world. The idea, which seemed somewhat fantastic in 2003, was that users of LifeLog would wear a device that would capture and record all of their transactions and interactions, physical movements, email and phone calls, and a variety of other information. The LifeLog would be presented to users as a standalone system to serve as a powerful automated multimedia diary and scrapbook, but, as the announcement goes on to reveal, the data collected would be used to help DARPA create a new class of truly cognitive systems that can reason in a variety of ways. If it had gone ahead, LifeLog would have been a virtual diary of everywhere that its users went, everything they did, everyone they talked to, what they talked about, what they bought, what they saw and listened to, and what they planned to do in the future. It immediately drew criticism as an obvious attempt by the government to create a tool for profiling enemies of the state, and even supporters of the plan were forced to admit that LifeLog could raise eyebrows if DARPA didn't make it clear how privacy concerns would be met. But then, without explanation, the announcement was withdrawn and the project was dropped. DARPA spokesperson Jan Walker chalked the cancellation up to a change in priorities at the agency, but researchers close to the project admitted that they were baffled by the sudden stopping of the program. I am sure that such research will continue to be funded under some other title, wrote one MIT researcher whose colleague had spent weeks working on the proposal. I can't imagine DARPA dropping out of such a key research area. The cancellation of LifeLog was reported by Wired.com on February 4, 2004. That very same day, a Harvard undergrad named Mark Zuckerberg officially launched thefacebook.com, the first incarnation of Facebook.
But how did they manage to get around the stigma, the ethical concerns, and sell it to the public? Well, some social engineering, of course. If only there was a way to make it cool and fashionable to post all the intimate details about your life. That way, the government doesn't have to spy on you. You spy on yourself. Well, yeah, that's Facebook. However, there's a few more aspects we need to consider as well. This is kind of like a little tangent, but I think it's important context. So, Mark Zuckerberg graduated from Harvard, right? It's also important to note that Harvard has running deals with intel agencies and collaborate with them to push their graduates into government programs. This goes back to Henry Kissinger's International Seminar. It's also worth noting that Klaus Schwab went to Kissinger's program back in the 1960s. and created his own version of this with the World Economic Forum, the Young Global Leaders Program. Anyway, with that said, this all ties into a different government program too. It's quite the sordid web. Check out this quote. Record every purchase you make with a credit card, every magazine subscription you buy, and medical prescription you fill, every website you visit and email you send or receive, every academic grade you receive, every bank deposit you make, every trip you book, and every event you attend. All these transactions and communications will go into a virtual, centralized, grand database, end of quote. And that's a quote from a book entitled You Are a Suspect, which came out in 2002, 2 years before Facebook launched and well before our current situation. However, as I said, with careful social engineering, today we're voluntarily participating in that same exact dystopian scenario. And so yeah, the author was not discussing Facebook or anything like that, but rather a program entitled Total Information Awareness, a DARPA program that proposed mining vast amounts of Americans' data to identify potential national security threats. The virtual grand database that they talk about was to belong to the Department of Defense, which would use it to identify behavior patterns that would help predict emerging terrorist threats. It kind of sounds like Palantir's predictive policing technology, doesn't it? And guess what? Palantir has a contract with the DoD. However, similar to LifeLog, they got some criticism about the Total Information Awareness Program. The concerns revolved around ethical boundaries on domestic spying. Concern about this program was surprisingly bipartisan and widespread. For example, the Cato Institute warned of the potential for a surveillance society and raised Fourth Amendment concerns. The ACLU called it a virtual dragnet that would require the government to collect as much information as it can about everyone, which includes not only government records of all kinds, but individuals' medical, financial records, political beliefs, travel history, prescriptions, buying habits, communications, phone calls, emails, web surfing, school records, personal and family associations, and so on. Wow, that kind of sounds like a pitch for digital ID, doesn't it? As that program is pushed by global leaders today, it collates and collects all personal data about you and centralizes it to your identity, all captured by a unique QR code. Just look at the image on the screen. This is the digital ID infrastructure. Everything they mentioned is included in this proposal. So it did not die, but what happened to this Total Information Awareness project? Well, after the Senate voted unanimously to defund the program, they simply shuffled the technology into other parts of the government that, and I quote, were not focused on the daily activities of U.S. citizens. Yeah, right. However, the story does not end there, because as this project was being disassembled in Washington, D.C., a similar system emerged and began to gather momentum in Silicon Valley. Within a few years, top industry trend reports and VC blog posts began to talk up the power and economic promise of big data and social networks. And as stated, we are now living that dystopian reality in real time. It's all about incremental steps. You know, to me, it's pretty crazy that at the time, pretty much every politician was against this surveillance state, because today, I cannot imagine having any representative that actually pushes back against this. You know, we do have guys like Thomas Massey, but they're few and far between, that's for sure. And it's only been about 20 years since all this happened. As I said, it's all about incremental steps. And in fact today, you can probably name several companies that have access to data on every purchase you make with a credit card, every website you visit, an email you send or receive, every trip you book, and every event you attend. All the various types of data that DARPA originally referenced. It's a business model these days. That's right, they turned this spying tool into an economic powerhouse by allowing it to be privatized while still maintaining heavy ties to the US government, of course. However, they built an entire economic ecosystem based on identifying behavior patterns that help predict what ads you'll click on. Big data is also considered to be the new gold rush, too. And now we're finding out that the grandfather of Jeff Bezos helped get DARPA off the ground in the first place, which I believe gives us more evidence regarding big tech companies simply being extensions of the US military-industrial complex and the US government. I mean, just for an example, we just discussed DARPA's role in creating the internet as a whole, their role in funding Google's initial research, and of course Facebook or Meta. For further proof, we just have to consider the black budget projects and military contracts that all of these companies have too. For example, Amazon handles the CIA's cloud computing services, and much more too. Oh, the web they weave, huh? And so, with all that said, let's go through some interesting stories about DARPA itself and find out a little bit more. Let's focus on their history and some of their more strange projects. And I quote, The story of science in the service of war could start just about anywhere in human history, from Persia with Alexander the Great to Egypt with Napoleon. In her book about DARPA, Sharon Weinberger selects as her starting point Nagasaki, and the point of view of a 6-year-old boy waking up to a city of rubble and seared flesh after the second, and so far, last atomic bomb ever used on Earth. That cataclysmic moment is indeed the right place to begin the story of DARPA, because it was DARPA scientists who were tasked with applying their genius to a dark, new reality. And I quote, "The atomic bomb had proved that knowledge was power, and whatever nation had the most knowledge would have an edge in the next war." She also speaks about someone who worked for President Dwight D. Eisenhower's Secretary of Defense, who wrote after his first doomsday tour of America's nuclear Armageddon machine, which was actually around the time DARPA began, that he had entered a world, and I quote, "where horror is as much a part of the scene as manufacturing cost is to the soap business," end of quote. So, one of the agency's first jobs was to arrange putting the first US rocket launched capsule into outer space, which was a project hastily pulled together in order to catch up with the Soviets. The space race was, after all, a propaganda war, and it's hard to imagine today, but at the time, the US was losing. However, once NASA took over the space projects, the DARPA scientists turned to another big job in the jungles of Southeast Asia. In Vietnam in 1950, the US Embassy in Saigon did not have a single officer who spoke Vietnamese. What they lacked in cultural understanding, though, the Americans made up for with science. By 1961, the US was moving closer to war, as their PSYOP schemes were not working to deter the Viet Cong. Now, they did have some interesting plans, though, that's for sure. One plan was to play on local superstitions. For example, in the Philippines, an American ad man turned CIA officer had persuaded the anti-communist government to capture a rebel, drain his blood, and leave 2 puncture holes in his neck to play on the villagers' fear of vampires. Social engineering, however, took second place to designing new hardware and weapons. For Vietnam, DARPA men dreamed up fuel-efficient airborne Volkswagens, landmines disguised as rocks, thermobaric weapons, and even Agent Orange was one of the agency's Vietnam legacies. The bizarre and crazy plans cooked up by DARPA's mad scientists over the years could fill many books, and Weinberger was spoiled for choice. A physicist named Nicholas Christophilos wanted to build a planetary force field to protect America from nuclear weapons. When that did not prove feasible, he came up with Project Seesaw, which involved drilling tunnels under the continent through which particle beams could be accelerated and aimed at incoming missiles. In order to build this in a cost-efficient manner, he proposed nuking the ground to create the holes. Now, there was one big problem. An effective particle beam would also drain the entire US power grid. So he proposed nuking another vast hole next to the Great Lakes and draining them in just 15 minutes to power vast generators. And well, that's insane. Stay away from my Great Lakes, alright? A scientist who was there for that presentation said it went over well. The scientists in the room all nodded their heads and said, "My God, Nick, that may work." Project Seesaw was never funded at the requested $300 million, but it was, Weinberger writes, the longest-lasting project the agency ever planned, still on the table in the mid-1970s. And, yeah, these people are out of their minds. However, I do have some more weird stories. Check this one out. After John F. Kennedy's assassination, DARPA looked for ways to protect future presidents. Privately, they codenamed this project Operation Barn Door. Among their various ideas, they tried to create a mirage-producing system to heat air or gas around the speaking president to foil marksmen. Also, putting a fake bulletproof sunshade on his head, an idea the scientists suggested that might also require spreading fake weather reports to justify its use. Yeah, good idea. Now, notoriously, they spent tens of millions of dollars on psychics to test ESP. In this effort, they did not go quite as far as the Russians, who were intrigued by a theory of parapsychology that proposed a link between mothers and children, in which mothers might sense an offspring's death over long distances. The Soviets tested this theory by using a mother and baby bunnies, and according to Weinberger, it worked so well that the Soviets considered using bunnies as a possible communication tool for submarines. What? Using bunnies for communication between submarines. Alright then. However, DARPA's greatest accomplishment was probably stealth technology for aircraft. They ran these tests out of Area 51 and contributed to the lore of UFOs. Now, I have a few more crazy DARPA stories, and then we'll get into some, modern horrors. I have a little problem with the framing of this next part, and I'll explain why in a second. And I quote, "Her book introduces a cast of men, some actual mad scientists, Others the kind of bureaucrats who only differ with what kind of suits they wear. However, the operative word being men. The agency had been around for 5 decades when President Barack Obama appointed the first female director, end of quote. Ah yes, they're implying that men are the problem here. But who's this first female director that's supposedly going to put an end to the mad scientists? Well, that happens to be Regina Dugan, who is also a crazy person, and somewhat of a mad scientist, and started working on DNA weapons and, of course, mRNA technology. We've talked about her before, actually, with the project known as the Wellcome Trust. Now, after she left DARPA, Regina Dugan began working for big tech companies such as Google and Facebook. Her main focus is artificial intelligence. In fact, at Bilderberg 2015, she gave a speech on that subject, and one of her main fortes is human-machine symbiosis. And so, I just thought that was pretty important context. Anyway, with that being said, why don't we talk about these modern horrors? Let's get into this aspect right here. There's really a lot to cover, so for the last segment, let's jump over to an eye-opening article by The Last American Vagabond. There is so much detail in here that I'm leaving out, so if you're interested in reading more, check out the link in the comments. Now, in order for people on YouTube to be able to watch this video, I have to be pretty careful with my wording. So if you wouldn't mind taking a look on the screen right here. When I say technology, this is going to be what I'm referring to. You know, the thing that no one is allowed to mention, because we live in a free society, right? And in some instances, I will be muting that word just because it won't make sense to substitute a different phrase, you know what I mean? Anyway, let's keep going. And I quote, DARPA began funding efforts to create multi-agent synthetic DNA technologies. Okay, yeah, you get the drift? This is what I'm going to be doing. Anyway, let me just start again. DARPA began funding efforts to create multi-agent synthetic DNA technologies that would be delivered into the human body via non-invasive electroporation. This category of vaccine would involve the same type of synthetic DNA that DARPA was also simultaneously researching for the purposes of both enhancing and subverting human beings at the genetic level. It was also this year, 2010, that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also began heavily funding DNA and RNA tech. Again, what a coincidence, huh? So, DNA vaccines, which were first created in 2005, have never been approved for human use in the United States, and past studies have warned that they, and I quote, possess significant unpredictability and a number of inherent harmful potential hazards. They also say, and I quote again, there is inadequate knowledge to define either the probability of unintended events or the consequences of genetic modifications. Another long-standing issue with this technology is mitigating, and I quote, unwanted immune reactions that result from the natural immune response to foreign genetic material. With everything we've experienced in 2020, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? In 2011, DARPA announced its Rapidly Adaptable Nanotherapeutics program, which sought to create a platform aimed at combating evolving pathogens and even genetically engineered bioweapons. DARPA's plan for these nanoparticles, which the media reports describe them as merely tiny autonomous drug delivery systems, was to combine them with small interfering RNA, which are snippets of RNA that can target and shut down specific genes. Now, I will say, of course, there is something that could be good for humanity with this. They could, shut down tumor growth and things like that. But you have to ask yourself, how much do you trust them? Because me, not so much.
In 2010, he interviewed Robert Freitas on the future of nanotechnology, who said that nanorobots could cure aging and death.
Medical nanorobots really have the potential to extend human life more or less indefinitely. So what's your view about the role of death, and do we need death?
Death is something that is an end. It's an end to life. It's an end to progress. It's an end to thoughts. It's something to be cured. Aging is a disease. It's a curable disease. Nanomedicine is the cure for that disease.
He said that this technology is expected to be deployed by 2020, and that laws will be in place to protect the public from its misuse.
I expect that by the time nanorobots are deployed, which will be sometime perhaps in the 2020s or the 2030s, we will have a whole set of laws in place, regulations. There will be things you can and cannot do.
The laws were never put in place, but the technology was patented and deployed to billions of people without their knowledge in 2020.
Anyway, the creation of this program was shortly followed by DARPA's decision in 2013 to fund Moderna to the tune of $25 million to develop their synthetic RNA technology platform. Once again, DARPA funded this project to develop platform technologies that can be deployed safely and rapidly to provide the entire U.S. population with near immediate protection against emerging infectious diseases and engineered biological weapons. End of quote. Well, damn, they came up a little short of that goal, didn't they? However, let's continue. So, moving on to 2015, DARPA's research into this new technology involving synthetic antibodies in synthetic genetic material expanded, with them giving $45 million to a company called Inovio Pharmaceuticals. And it was that same year that DARPA described this technology as transforming the human body into a bioreactor. You know, for years, DARPA has remained largely out of sight and out of mind for most Americans, as their research projects are rarely covered by the mainstream media. And when they are, their projects are often praised as bringing science fiction movies to life. However, there have been recent events that have marred DARPA's often positive portrayal by media outlets, which paint the agency as a beacon of scientific progress that has changed the world for the better. Although DARPA's futuristic weapons of war often get the most attention from the media, the agency has long-standing interest in tinkering with not just the biology of plants, but of humans. DARPA, which is funded to the tune of approximately $3 billion a year, has various avenues through which it pursues these ambitions, with many of those now under the purview of the agency's Biological Technologies Office, otherwise known as BTO, which was created in 2014. And so, most of these new technologies have garnered positive media coverage thanks to the pandemic, and the DARPA-funded program used to produce DNA and RNA technology. Yet key aspects regarding DARPA's healthcare initiatives have been left out of recent positive reports, likely because they provide a window into what is arguably the agency's darkest agenda. Notably, it is this technology, now being produced by DARPA partner companies, that billionaire and global health philanthropist Bill Gates recently asserted has him the most excited. And yeah, when Bill Gates is excited, you better be afraid.
Bill Gates recently admitted to this as well.
Making the mRNA is really easy and really cheap, and that's the magic of this thing. But there's no doubt in the next 5 years, we just need to mess around. There's a lot of lipid nanoparticles, and some are very self-assembling.
Self-assembly and self-replication seem to be the same technology when it comes to nanorobots. And this was considered to be the greatest danger involved with the use of this technology.
Self-replication causes disease. Nanorobots are inherently much stronger than biological systems being built of diamondoid. So if they self-replicate, that disease, quote unquote, could be even a tougher problem than biological disease. So first of all, what's the feasibility of self-replication in the nanotechnology world?
As a general principle, you do not want to put self-replicating nanorobots inside the human body. I suppose not everybody agrees with me on that, but that is the way I think that we can best guarantee safety. If the nanorobots are able to replicate inside the human body, that means they are using some component of the human body as food, and we don't want them to be doing that.
In his 1986 book, Engines of Creation, Kim Eric Drexler wrote about what he termed the gray goo scenario, a hypothetical catastrophic event caused by out-of-control, self-replicating nanotechnology, which consumes the biomass of the host.
Now, following the creation of DARPA's BTO in 2014, this particular program gave rise to the In Vivo Nano Platforms program. This program has since helped to finance and produce soft, flexible hydrogels that are injected just beneath the skin to perform health monitoring, and that sync to a smartphone app to give the user immediate health insights. End of quote. Ah yes, the biometric surveillance agenda. Perfect.
COVID is critical because this is what convinces people to accept, to legitimize total biometric surveillance. If we want to stop this epidemic, we need not just to monitor people, we need to monitor what's happening under their skin. What we have seen so far, it's corporations and governments collecting data about where we go, who we meet, what movies we watch. The next phase is the surveillance going under our skin. We're now seeing mass surveillance systems established even in democratic countries which previously rejected them. And we also see a change in the nature of surveillance. Previously, surveillance was mainly above the skin. Now it's going under the skin. Governments want to know not just where we go or who we meet. Above all, they want to know what is happening under our skin. What's our body temperature? What's our blood pressure? What is our medical condition? Now humans are developing even bigger powers than ever before. We are really acquiring divine powers of creation and destruction. We are really upgrading humans into gods.
And so, there's a company called Profusa, I believe, which is funded by DARPA, and they receive millions and millions of dollars every year from the government. And well, they are working on this exact project. They claim that the information generated by their injectable biosensor would safely be shared between the individual, their doctor, and public health bureaucrats. This biometric surveillance apparatus is essentially a national contact tracing system. It's all about collecting your private health data, and this is likely to expand. And, rather conveniently, this fits with DARPA's years-old goal of creating a database of preemptive diagnoses. In fact, they have been working on this for quite a long time, since 2006. Yes, that's right, in 2006, DARPA announced its Predicting Health and Disease program, which sought to determine whether an individual will develop infectious disease prior to the onset of symptoms. And as stated, these preemptive diagnoses would be transmitted to a national web-based pathogen map via smartphone. Ah yes, the extensive proposals for mass surveillance contact tracing, which is backed by various big tech companies such as Google. Again, what a coincidence. I'm telling you, these big tech companies are just the surveillance arm of the US government. This company Profusa, well, they also have US senators on their board of directors. On top of that, Profusa was recently awarded some new DARPA money to see if their biosensors could predict future pandemics. So yeah, this is not stopping. Now, this next part was, to me, the most interesting, and I quote, "Another long-standing DARPA program now overseen by the BTO is known as Living Foundries. According to DARPA's website, it's through this program called Living Foundries that DARPA is transforming synthetic biomanufacturing into a predictable engineering practice, supportive of a broad range of national security objectives," end of quote. The types of research this Living Foundries program supports involves the creation of artificial life, and this includes the creation of artificial genetic material, including artificial chromosomes, the creation of entirely new organisms, and using artificial genetic material to add new capacities to human beings. So, yeah, it's all tied into their transhuman agenda, i.e., genetically modifying humans through the insertion of synthetically created genetic material. Yeah.
For decades, Ray Kurzweil has been an unofficial spokesman for the transhumanist movement. And in 2008, he said that humans would become infused with nanorobots, which would vastly improve the human body.
If you go out even to 2045, that's only 4 decades from now, most of our intelligence, of our human civilization will be non-biological. We're going to put this inside our bodies and brains. So we're going to become machines, but not, and if you say that, then people go, well, I don't want to become a machine, because they're thinking of machines as we knew them from the 19th century, which were much lesser than humans, and machines today are still lesser than humans. I'm talking about a new type of machine that's actually greater, more subtle, more supple, more intelligent, more creative, more beautiful than humans.
Now, the latter is of particular concern, though all of this is honestly pretty concerning, as DARPA also has a project called Advanced Tools for Mammalian Genome Engineering, which, despite having mammalian in the name, is focused specifically on improving the utility of human artificial chromosomes. And so, research papers often focus on human artificial chromosomes as a revolutionary medical advancement. They are also frequently promoted as a means of enhancing humans, by imbuing them with non-natural characteristics, including halting aging or improving cognition. DARPA is also known to be involved in the research where these methods are used to create super soldiers. And through this technology, these quote-unquote super soldiers would no longer require sleep or food, among other augmented features. However, we should note that reports on these programs also discuss other very concerning aspects to this technology, including creating genetic weapons that would, and I quote, subvert DNA and undermine people's minds and bodies. Another potential application being actively investigated by DARPA is its biodesign program, which is examining the creation of synthetic organisms that are created to be immortal and programmed with a quote-unquote kill switch, which would allow a synthetic yet organic organism to be turned off at any time. And that right there has led some people to speculate that this kind of research could open the doors to the creation of human replicants, used for fighting wars and other tasks, such as those that appear in the science fiction film Blade Runner. However, these genetic kill switches could also be inserted into actual humans through artificial chromosomes. And so, just as they have the potential to extend life, they also have the potential to cut it short.
How do we prevent a terrorist or someone who's bent on destruction from creating such a self-replicating system?
There will be some terrorist acts because that's what humans do, unfortunately. So what we're going to be needing in this era of nanofactories is something equivalent to the fire department. Hopefully the incidents will be very few, but we will have an emergency regime which is set up to deal with that type of event.
Notably, it was revealed in 2017 that DARPA had invested $100 million into gene drive research, which involves the use of genetic modifications to wipe out entire populations, and that explains why it is often referred to as the genetic extinction technology. Wow. Damn. Alright then, how about we don't do that? Just a thought, right? In addition, other DARPA experiments involve the use of genetically modified viruses that insert genetic material into human cells, specifically neurons in the brain, in order to quote-unquote tweak human brain chemistry. In one example, DARPA funded research to alter human brain cells to produce 2 new proteins. The first one allowed neural activity to be easily detected by external devices, and second, allowing magnetic nanoparticles to induce an image or sound in the patient's mind. End of quote. So yeah, subliminal messaging is going to new heights.
If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen.
It depends on you.
And with all that said, I'll try to sum everything up. DARPA's transhumanist vision for the military and for humanity presents an unprecedented threat, not just to human freedom, but an existential threat to human existence and the building blocks of biology itself. And so, if I was a betting man and we were betting on the end of the world, I'd put my money on the mad scientists.
And to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals or Subscribestar. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas, and yes, I do hope you have a good night.